Good evening, everybody. I'm Peg Breen. I'm president of the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to an evening with Robert A.M. Stern at home in New York. We're going to be looking at a wide range of his city projects. As you know, Bob is a noted architect, historian, writer, and teacher. He was dean of Yale School of Architecture and director of Columbia's Historic Preservation Program. He's written a series of encyclopedic books about New York City architecture and is just about completing his latest one in that project. He's received numerous architectural awards. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And we are pleased to have honored him as a living landmark. Before we begin, just a note that we will mute you through the program. We will have time for questions, but if you would put them into the chat room as you think of them, it would help us enormously, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. So Bob, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us this evening.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this with some fear and trepidation. It's a little bit like my life being unspooled, but we'll see how it goes.
It's going to go well. So
Good.
Here we are. Let's start with the first project here. I was surprised that you, as a quite young graduate architect, went to work for the city. Why did you do that?
I went to work for the city. I was part of a group of people who independently and in collaboration with each other decided to do that. Coming out of Yale, we worked for John Lindsay, who was fighting an uphill battle to succeed A.M as mayor, but he did. And Jack Robertson, who's a good friend of mine, encouraged me to come down to the city. Robertson had started the urban design group under Lindsay's watchful eye, and I joined HDA, Housing and Development Administration, with the intention of affecting the quality of life and the arrogant attention of a 28-year-old.
Well, Lindsay was kind of a golden era for the best and the brightest for a while. Would you encourage young architects to go into government now?
I'm not sure I would. It was great in my day because planning and the whole apple cart of what was planning and urban development was being turned upside down. Let's call it the post-Jane Jacobs syndrome. And also planning was an active sport, let's say. Today, planning is a more of a review process. And I'm not sure how many architects are really needed in that process. Planning has been reverted out of the city to individual consulting firms, architects in particular. So I don't know. I don't want to discourage people from having the experience of working for the city, which I found very fascinating. And I did it for about 2.5 years, and then I had to move on to do other things. But I'm not sure I would encourage a young architect to take it on.
Okay, well, let's look at some of your early apartments.
I began independent practice in 1969, and the first kinds of practice I had, and many of my colleagues, my generational colleagues did the same, was to remodel apartments for young families who had chosen to stay in the city rather than moving to the suburbs, and were able to buy at relatively affordable rates these big apartments on the west side and some on the east side. But they found that these apartments had lots of maid rooms, horrible kitchens, inadequate or too small bathrooms, and that the rooms themselves were boxy, and they what I call dinner is served rooms, as though the doors would be flung open and some well-tailored butler or serving maid would announce the meal. That's not the way anybody was living, and even then in the late 60s. So we opened up the plans. A couple of these apartments were mine on the top, and the ones on the bottom were for specific clients. I think I ruined a lot of really nice Beaux-Arts style apartments in the process of doing this. And for my sins, I would hope I could get an opportunity every now and again, and I have, to put them back together in a new way.
Does your current apartment still have wild Andy Warhol cow wallpaper?
Uh, the cow wallpaper, I framed it image by image and sitting in storage, but I still have quite a lot of pop art and or realist art from that period of time. I haven't collected for in any significant way, except architectural drawings, which are on another wall here where I'm seated, which I started to collect, or which were easy to collect in the late 1980s. I'm not a collector at heart, though.
Well, you've always been interested in urban issues and how architects affects the city. And you entered a competition for designing Roosevelt Island before anything happened there. And this is now what Roosevelt Island looks like today, but tell us what you were going to do and tell us why this interested you enough to go through all this.
Well, housing was this was an outgrowth of my work at HDA, where I was involved with trying to, the zoning was changed in 1961, but it was the then new zoning was very unfriendly to streets and the scale of neighborhoods. It was all about towers and plazas, and it made housing degenerated into a series of slabs slapped down into the city grid. As you know, the prototype for that was Manhattan House on 3rd Avenue, a huge building isolated from the city all around it. So the Roosevelt Island scheme, which was on as I recall, a 9-acre site facing the East River, was a competition sponsored by the state. My idea was to have low, that is about 6-story buildings. You can see them in the slide, that would bring the main street of Roosevelt Island into the heart of this site, and would have apartments that people could walk up to, although there were elevators. And then along the river, there would be 3 dramatically shaped towers, which would curve in their plan to look downriver to the Midtown skyline. Behind it, you can see the huge garage that was built that bounded the site, as well as the bridge over to Long Island City, which many of you may be familiar with. So the jury was split. 3 or 4 of the winners all looked like the stuff that is built on Roosevelt Island, which I was against, with the high buildings in the middle of the island, stepping down with these giant steps, which were never landscaped and were not shared by the tenants of the apartment buildings. And then ours, which was quite controversial. Interestingly enough, many years later, I learned that Paul Rudolph, my teacher at Yale, was adamantly against my scheme. So he done me in.
Oh, dear. Okay, well, let's look at another plan you had for a suburb in the city.
This was done as a theoretical project for the Venice Biennale, which had for the first time an architecture section. In 1980, for the first time, there was an entire Biennale for architecture, which has continued to this day. But in 1976, they had a section, and Peter Eisenman was asked to organize, I think it was 6 American architects, to invite 6 American architects to share their ideas about the city with 6 architects who were European, mostly Italian. So my idea, and I said to Peter, well, what's going to organize the American contribution? And I proposed the idea of the suburb. We all were doing either single family houses like Richard Meyer, or other architects were trying to work with the suburban problem, Bob Venturi, for example. So this was my proposal, which was for a subway suburb. You can see the elevated train. At this point, the whole of Brownsville in East New York was largely bereft of developments, and the UDC itself was building a Marcus Garvey Gardens across the street from the site I chose. But my idea was that you could keep the streets, not create super blocks. You could shape the streets around mid-block parks, as you can see, and so the utilities would remain under the streets, and you can use single and duplex houses to get a high density, where people would have their own backyards, they have their own place to park their cars, so that the suburban scale could be brought into the outer boroughs, as it once was, say, at Forest Hills Gardens. Still, it remains very successful as a place, a very desirable place. So that was the scheme here. I think I have another slide of it.
Yes, I was about to say, let's see what the houses look like.
Here you can see one of those mid-block parks that I proposed, and the houses were like villa-like houses. Some of them, others were based on shingle-style cottage precedents. But you can also see in the drawing on the right, 2 sets of front doors, because those are really 2 houses together. That's an idea that goes back to the Garden City movement of the group house. And if you go out to Forest Hills Gardens, for example, or other such developments, you'll see 2 to 8 houses grouped together. So you have the intimacy of small scale development, and the sense of individuality, which European modernists were virulently against as being too bourgeois. But I always thought the bourgeois idea was a very appealing idea in making places for people to live.
And interestingly enough, now you have planners who are trying to wipe out single family housing so that we can be denser than ever.
Well, I'm not sure that I would go along with that. I think part of the American dream, going back to the founding of the Republic, is that every family has its own castle. And that was a Jeffersonian idea. And it's not, nothing is for everybody. People should have choices. So that was very much what Subway Suburb was about. And it proved premonitory for me of lots of different developments that I've done over the years, leading up, I suppose, to Celebration in Florida for the Disney Company, where we got to plan on a 5,000 acre virtually new town.
Well, let's jump back into the city and go to 42nd Street. You've had a long involvement with attempts to revive the city, the street, and actually reviving the street.
Well, we first were involved with it in collaboration with Hugh Hardy, who was asked to work on one side of 42nd Street, the south side, and we on the north side, to take a look at the theaters that were already there. You see Hardy's scheme on the right, ours in the left-hand side. And the theaters were in terrible shape. And in fact, one of the teams of people from our office who had to go inside to measure them at night when the porn movies were turned off for a couple of hours, they actually found somebody dead in the seat and nobody even noticed. So it gives you a sense of the horrible conditions. So our scheme was to reuse the theaters as theaters, to try to combine a couple of them, which did happen, so that they'd have bigger accommodation, better backstage, and then to fill in where there was an opportunity to make a new building. I took the scheme that was Joseph Urban had developed in the 20s for a theater. You can see that black and white striped building with the mast, and and we put that in. I thought I'm a great admirer of what Urban did as a set designer and an architect, like the new school main building in the Village. So that was what we did, and we had an exhibition at the Urban Center on Madison Avenue, and we prepared detailed drawings of the buildings, the theaters, which became the basis for going forward. But the city could not interest anybody in the project beyond that. There had been other efforts to make a Disneyland there and others, and they all had faltered. And partially for the lack of interest of the mayor, Ed Koch wasn't particularly interested, and even the governor then, Mario Cuomo, was not interested. No one realized, it took quite a while for them to realize the importance of these theaters had to the culture of the city, of course, but to the economic vitality of the city. So when new regime came in,
And I
Mayor
think,
Giuliani,
yeah,
who
let's
had a sense of the theater,
screen.
we were invited back to compete as the designers for an interim plan for 42nd Street. Interim was then seen to be 15 years, and the plan would be paid for by money spun off by the office buildings and the site and the purchase of land sites around Times Square and 42nd Street. Once the
advance again, Rick.
Sorry.
I'm telling Rick to advance because
Well, go back 1 second. I just want to say one more thing, if you don't mind.
no.
This was the condition of the street when we were hired in 1992. It was still showing mainstream movies, but at the third run, and it had burlesque, and it was a mess. And as you can see, not a lot of people walking on the street. Next slide, please. One of the things we had to do was convince people that 42nd Street was important. And so we studied it in many ways. These drawings showed how so many important cultural institutions, from the United Nations to Grand Central Station, Public Library, all the way to the Intrepid at the Hudson, all were on 42nd Street. It was the key street for tourism and many ways for culture in the city. And it also had great transportation. But when we said that you could have great shops on 42nd Street, it could be vital, Faith Hope Consolo, the great expert on retail leasing, came to a meeting and said, "Are you kidding? There'll never be a store on 42nd Street." At which time the Gap opened its shop at Broadway and 42nd Street. Turned out to be the highest grossing shop that they had in the entire country. So Faith was wrong, and she eventually admitted so to me and to others. Next, we can go on.
Yep.
So we studied what 42nd Street was like. As you can see, why it had a tremendous vitality, signage, lighting, and whatever. And we adopted those ideas. We tried to give them a structure, as you can see on the top left, and wrote those principles into the leases that the state entered into once Disney decided to come and take over the New Amsterdam Theater, which they did when they decided to go into big time into the theater business in New York, and realized that the real money to be made was not from selling tickets, but from owning the theaters where the tickets were used. And they've never regretted that decision. So here's how it looked around the year 2000.
Should we advance? See the next slide here?
Yeah, I hope so. And so we made a drawing, and we worked with Paul Whalen, my partner, was very much part of this enterprise, as was Tibor Kalman, the great designer. And we made this drawing to show what 42nd Street could be like. And we used this to sell things. One of the parts of the drawing that I'm particularly proud of is this great globe we proposed, which would have screens representing all the different streaming services. Only streaming services barely existed in the year 1992 when we made this drawing. But it anticipated the role of global communications. Of course, 42nd Street really took off when Michael Eisner decided to take over the New Amsterdam, and people began to realize that it and Times Square would be on every television broadcast when in the millennium, celebrating the millennium. And suddenly companies which refused to accept Rebecca Robertson's phone calls about leasing space on 42nd Street flooded her emails and telephones with saying, "When can we get a tour? What can we take on?" And the tide turned overnight. I became an instant hero. what I'd always wanted to be. You can see all the office buildings. With Paul Whalen, we review every drawing for every building on 42nd Street. Every shop, as one shop might close up and a new one come in, has to toe the line to this 42nd Street rules that we put into the leases. One of the most interesting things was that our leases said you have to be as bright as what preceded you. So whereas most leasing agreements with fancy developers like George Klein and others call for tiny, discrete lettering, subdued colors, subdued lighting, we said the brighter, the better. And at a certain point in the late 90s, running up to the millennium, Consolidated Edison called the state and said, you know, we're having a problem. Our grid of power is being used up in 42nd Street and Times Square, and we weren't prepared for it. No surprise that they weren't prepared. There hadn't been anything happening there in 20 years.
We have one more slide, which just reminds us of what we're missing.
This was the great moment when, and Rebecca Robertson and a collaboration, Cora Khan at the New 42. This is the great moment. McDonald's was there, hotel, Madame Tussauds, the theaters were back in action. We were able to rebuild the steps leading up to what had once been the Belasco Theater, becomes a great perching place to take in the show of the sidewalk activity. So it's a great moment for the street. Everybody, the highbrow critics, including, I regret, the critic for the Times, said we've ruined the street. The hookers were gone. There were no more muggers. The street had been in the late 80s so destitute of life that German tourists literally came to visit and take in as part of their visits to New York the empty 42nd Street as a symbol of the decay of our culture. They were thrilled about how Berlin was opening up, and it seemed as the 42nd Street city was closing down. So it came back to life in an instant. Of course, I hope it will come back to life again in an instant very soon.
Absolutely. Well, let's go on to another competition.
Well, the Municipal Art Society persuaded the related companies to hold a competition for the design of an apartment building and retail complex at the bottom of Union Square, an incredibly important site because the access of Park Avenue South is terminated by whatever gets built there. And we proposed this scheme with a tower that would echo the scale or the silhouette of the tower that was now obscured behind the Pan Am building, but once was visible on Park Avenue South. Next slide. But we were not selected because the Municipal Art Society wanted a public work of art. And they picked this one, which I have to say does not live up to my standards of public art. And I don't think the building took into consideration the urbanism of the site as I had seen it and as I think it ought to have been. But related, which was just getting into the apartment building business in the city, was David Wine of that company and Steve Ross, the head, were happy with the way we worked on the project and gave us a number of subsequent opportunities. Next slide. One of which was Tribeca Park, one of the big buildings to face the Hudson in Battery Park City. Battery Park City was accused of being too diminutive and on its toes, so to speak, in the south side of the World Financial Center. So on the north side, we were asked in the first building to connect more to the language of Tribeca and the industrial buildings there. So you see the water tower we put on the top. You can see the big scale of the openings. If you could see more closely, you would see a lot of use of metal on the facades. And so the building was meant to bring Battery Park City and Tribeca into consort. Next slide. That related to invite us to compete with another office, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, as it turns out, for the design of a high-end apartment building on 3rd Avenue and 65th Street. The interesting thing about that site was that 3rd Avenue was not considered high-end territory at that time. Moreover, related had the ambition to bring the quality of Park Avenue, the look and feel of Park Avenue onto this site, which overlooked at the west, commanded the whole of the Upper East Side historic district and its low buildings, and you could see west to Central Park and even to the Hudson River. So it was a spectacular site. And we decided to emulate the work of Rosario Candela on Park Avenue in the handling of the elements of this building. Next slide, please. And I'm a great admirer of Candela's 778 Park Avenue, which is a wonderful juxtaposition of regularly proportioned windows, which sometimes have broken to have French balconies, and has a strong treatment of the rooftop silhouette where the water tower is. We have a water tower in our building. So you can see how we learn from the past. I'm always interested in carrying the past forward. I guess I haven't emphasized that enough in what I've been saying, but you go backward, in my opinion, to go forward. There's nothing more boring than a building that is completely of its moment, because here today, gone tomorrow is the way it usually happens. Next slide, please. Then the Zeckendorfs, the 3rd generation of a very distinguished family of developers, came to us with this incredible site. Again, a competition. We competed here against Caesar Pelli, who had a great success with Beacon Court over on the east side. And he proposed a glass building, which is, of course, perfectly in the Pelli mode. I felt we should do a stone building. It's there hadn't been a limestone building or stone building, and the site is very complicated, a full block. I don't have time to go into it, but 15 Central Park West, our clients went full bore for it. We used the Empire stone from the Empire Quarry in Indiana, the same stone you find on, for example, the Empire State Building. And we created a tall building at the back and a low building in the front with a courtyard in the center, and studied very carefully a full repertoire of details from buildings we loved on the Upper East Side and River House and so forth. And we laid out a building which had no more than 2 apartments to an elevator core. That's very different from a building, say, like the typical Manhattan House model, where you have long corridors serving 10 or 12 apartments, like Kips Bay, for example. So we return to an old model, which means that you have apartments at the end, which have 3 exposures, and you have mid-block buildings, which have 2 exposures, which was very, very special for the people that moved there. It was, needless to say, a great success. It was dubbed by the real estate industry as the Limestone Jesus, and it set a new standard. It also has recreational facilities, pools, movie screening rooms, and so forth, so that it has a quality of a club and includes a restaurant, which is only open to use of the residents and their guests. Next slide, please.
Can I just ask you a question on this, though?
Yeah.
And going forward, too, you love limestone and you use various types of limestone. Why is that so popular?
Well, I love limestone. I love stone. Limestone, we have wonderful limestones, but I like the use of stone. First of all, these stone apartment buildings that we've designed set themselves apart from the typical corporate office building. I don't think people really want to come home to an office building. They want to come home to something that has the scale of individual windows. You can say where living rooms and so forth are, as opposed to smaller rooms, bedrooms, or what have you. Now, why stone? Because stone picks up the light amazingly. Glass buildings just reflect. And in fact, people argue that they're translucent or transparent rather, but they're not actually. They are like mirrors. Here you have the building that picks up the light. You can watch the sun move from the morning to night across the surface and different shades and shadows, particularly if you introduce a vocabulary of details, which we fortunately do and did. And that's why I picked limestone. This is from Indiana. 220 Central Park South, which is virtually complete, has an Alabama stone. We've used French limestone. So the variations and also how you can cut the stone and finish it is wonderful. And I think much more interesting than a glass curtain wall.
Right. But you also honored Central Park West and you finished it off.
Yes, we were the last tooth missing. We replaced in a very unfortunately renovated pair of buildings called the Mayflower Hotel. And we were able to buttress, as it were, the whole side of Central Park West going up and protect it from the Gulf and Western building, which my mentor and friend Philip Johnson had reclad as the Trump International Hotel. He did a pretty good job, but still in all, it was a jarring note in the building, related less to Central Park West than to the new buildings being built at Columbus Circle, designed by David Childs, for related.
All right, so I want to go on to 520 Park.
520 Park, people are very concerned about the super tall buildings, and there are some reasons to be worried about their impact on the city skyline, but many of them, including 520 and 220 Central Park South, are relatively small buildings. Certainly 520 is a needle-like tower that joins the Sherry, Netherlands, and the Pierre and the skyline. It's very tall and slender. It has one apartment per floor where it doesn't have duplexes and triplexes. So it's a highly luxurious building. That's almost a square proportion. And it uses the air rights of and builds partially cantilevered over the Grolier Club next door by Bertrand Goodhue. And it uses air rights from Christ Church by Ralph Cram on Park Avenue. Now, people say, oh, isn't that terrible that these buildings are selling their air rights? Well, it's good for them to be able to maintain their buildings where they often can't afford to do it properly. But it also guarantees that those buildings will never be built up again. They will never be threatened again. So we create a skyline that is of the present and going into the future, which combines old buildings and new buildings in compositions that I think work very well. When Henry James came back to New York after a 20-year hiatus at the beginning of the 20th century, he remarked of the skyscrapers in lower Manhattan, which were beginning to dominate the city, that they were like pins in a pincushion. And so these needle-like towers are like pins in the pincushion of Manhattan's city streets. So I'm very proud of these buildings, and I think 520 has wonderful details and has a fantastic little, well, it's not so little, but pavilion up at the top, going with the top apartment, and we've, with the Zeckendorf's enthusiasm, the whole of the street that it sits on has new signage, new lampposts, and has been transformed from what it was getting to be quite ragtag into something quite elegant.
Speaking of elegant, we have 220 Central Park South.
Well, this is an amazing building. Unlike the tall buildings, other super talls thus far realized, which are actually on 57th Street and have lower buildings in front of them, this is a building that makes its own context with a lower building called the Villa facing the park, and then rising behind it It's a similar strategy to 15 Central Park West, with a big motor court separating the two is this tower, which is a little bit longer in its east-west proportion than its north-south. And it has a wealth of apartment varieties, which are given expression on the facade. And it has small balconies and large setback terraces and other elements that enliven what is a big building, but nothing compared to the one that's growing up and still being constructed behind it. So you get a kind of feeling of foothills in the mountain range, if you will. I'm confident that this represents a good and new scale. Think of what Central Park South was like when it was transformed from its 19th century buildings, which some of which were only 4 or 5 stories high. And then you had the Sherry and the Essex House. And even the plaza is a huge building. It's the second one or the third one, I can't remember, to be built on that site. It jumped the scale. So we're used to jumping the scale. That's one of the New York facts of life. And so 220, and you'll never get to see the inside, most people, but the public space, the tenant spaces, the apartment plans, we worked on with Terry Dispont. And again, there's fantastic swimming pool, restaurant, and so forth. It becomes a club and a hotel for resident hotel, if you will.
Actually, Steve Roth brought me in one day, and it's gorgeous. But the other thing that strikes me about this building, as compared to the other super talls going around 57th Street, is this is still a New York building. You know, this.
Well, I'm a New York architect, and even though we built now in other places, and particularly China, and has taken note of what we've done here in New York, but our buildings, which we built in China, use similar principles: low buildings framing the street, taller buildings punctuating the sky. We do not carry forward the vocabulary here. This is a New York vocabulary that's evolved over 100 years of time.
Well, you're also
and I think it interests me that these buildings that are occupied pretty much by New Yorkers. Everybody thinks it's all these buildings are filled up with Russian oligarchs. I have nothing against Russian oligarchs, but they're not necessarily the principal occupants of these buildings.
Well, you also do luxury downtown. So here we are at Superior Ink.
Well, Steve Ross brought us in. There had been a factory here for making ink for the printing trade, but that was a thing of the past. Steve wanted to develop an apartment building here, and he got Charlie Gothamy took it through a very angry village crowd, which doesn't like any change whatsoever. But Charlie felt that it was not in his vocabulary to develop the kind of building that would further the support of the community. So Steve brought us in, and we created a design that I think carries the industrial quality of the original building, again with metal details and carefully proportioned windows and a kind of canopy that's an industrial type canopy leading into the apartment building. But also around the corner, attached to the development, was a row of townhouses, which evoke the West Village scale. These townhouses are quite interesting in that they're all connected underground to the parking and to the main lobby, so you can enter the lobby, pick up your mail, and go into your house, or you can come off the side street, as it were. In order to find the scale of these townhouses, we combed the surviving townhouses of the Greek Revival period, in particular in the Federal period, in the Village and the Lower East Side, and also buildings that were built to emulate them by top architects like McKinney and White and Delano and Aldrich on the Upper East Side. So again, these are buildings that are very New York buildings. The tall building is a New York industrial building. The low building is our townhouses go back to have their tentacles in the early 19th century city. you were about to show, we've done another building for related facing what is now wonderfully restored. I mean, when I was still at the city, I watched the early days of the Westway project, where the whole highway was going to be buried and land was going to be created for development. And I thought, this is really not a sensible way to go. How about just making a great street, and the cars will adjust to it? And that's what we have on West Street. And yes, the traffic backs up once in a while, but basically we created a new face to Lower Manhattan, and Superior Inc. takes advantage of that face, is part of that face. And this 70 Vestry Street has a French limestone, and on the outside, a very intricate rhythm of a symmetrically massed building. And then behind it is a courtyard, which is where you enter the building, and a drop off. So it gives people a tremendous amount of privacy. Also, it deals with, which Superior Inc. did not, with the flood as a result of the hurricane. So the struggle in designing these buildings in Lower Manhattan is to make a friendly pedestrian scale, and yet recognize that the building's first floor has to be raised significantly above street level to battle floods. So I don't want to go into a technical issue, but it has a strong urban implication. And these setbacks, which when I was in architecture school, we were told that setbacks were terrible. That everything should look like the Seagram building, an unbroken tower on a majestic open plaza. Well, I love the Seagram building, but I don't love the little Seagram buildings that proliferated all around town, and the terrible plazas that were made that were fit for no human activity, really, but or just little slivers of leftover space. In any case, here we have a symmetrical building with elaborate setbacks, which create tremendously desirable terraces. Since 15 Central Park West, and with 220 Central Park South, and 520 Park Avenue, we have responded to New Yorkers who love to have some open space. They want to be able to go out and have a drink and watch the sunset. They want to have some greenery there. They want to be able to entertain their friends there. And so we put back into the vocabulary, not the kind of balconies that were built in the 50s and 60s, which looked like tongue depressors. I always thought of them, where the doctor says, say, ah, and he sticks something in your mouth. And only fit for storing bicycles. These are outdoor rooms, if you will. I think, am I done? Or
Oh, no, you're not done yet. And in fact,
oh my God,
the next
yes,
building is not done either.
We're doing another one facing the river, the Cortlands, it's called. It's at 23rd Street, and it takes some of these same principles. And whereas 70 Vestry Street is super high end, this will be more affordable. I won't say they will be low end, but they will be more affordable. And this building is clad in brick, which allows us to have an enormous wealth of details, and it wraps around 23rd Street, and it plays with the aesthetics of London Terrace, which is a couple of blocks away. Next slide.
Well, now we're going to get into your speaking out on issues. And this is where we met, Bob. This is the year you called up and yelled at me because the Conservancy was not supporting modern landmarks. And you changed all the preservation groups into supporting them.
Well, I'm glad I had that impact, and I'm glad, Peg, that you've become such an important, and the Preservation Foundation as well, important voice for saving buildings. The New York landmarks law is unique in the country, I think, still, that it allows for buildings to be landmarked after 30 years. 30 years is a terrible moment for buildings, because the owners, sometimes there are new owners or 2 or 3 new owners, want to rip out the lobbies, reclad the buildings. You all know what they want to do, and destroy the value that the original building created. So Peg was kind enough to help me get this article published in the Times. And I turned to buildings of different aesthetics, from my beloved Brooklyn Public Library, where I spent many hours as a junior high and high school student, to Philip Johnson's townhouse on 52nd Street, to the Knickerbocker Laundry, which has been turned into a Korean church and has lost its character. So we lost that one, to the Moses Building at Montefiore, to the bus station up at Port Authority and on George Washington Bridge, which no one even realized was designed at that time by a top architect, Pierluigi Nervi. It has now been treated with some respect that had not been. And then my beloved Lost to Columbus Circle, where Ada Louise Huxtable refused to revisit in a positive way her damning of the original Ed Stone building, and where we got a building which I have no respect for now, and already is beginning to look completely dated, and has no, my way of thinking, visual logic. The Museum of Art and Design, appropriately called MAD. Next slide, please. This gets my blood to boil. We were we were invited to create a new library for what is now Bronx Community College, which occupies many of the buildings that had been designed, that were realized, of McKim Meaden White's 1900 plan for NYU's Uptown campus, seen in an old postcard and in the plan, where the Hall of Fame, much unvisited, I'm sad to say, wraps around the Gould Library, the beautiful domed Gould Library. Next slide, please. In the 1950s, the NYU still was using the campus as its Uptown campus, mostly for engineering, and they decided, as so many institutions did, to ignore their classical campus and go modern. And they invited the very well-known Marcel Breuer. He had a bit of a heavy hand, architecturally speaking. Philip Johnson called him a peasant mannerist. And he built these buildings here, including the strangely projecting Beggarish Hall Auditorium. Next slide. But can we go to the next slide? But we were asked to come back and we were fine, to build a library. Now, Bronx Community College is a commuters college. The people who come and study here are frequently employed and have families of their own, children at home, and they need a place to go where they can get some peace and quiet and do their work, their school work. So this library is not only a place as a repository for books, but it's a refuge from the helter-skelter life of so many people who want to improve their lives through higher education. So we had a wonderful client, and Iris Weinshall was very supportive when she was at the construction agency, and we had a very favorable market, and we were able to realize this building on the side of the campus. The center of the campus, as you can see it here, as we were able to restore it, was, at the time we arrived, a parking lot. Next slide, please. So here's an aerial view. You see the restored campus, which conforms more or less to the McKim Olmsted original. The library needs a lot of money and tender care to bring it up to speed. The old Gould Library is one of the most beautiful rooms in the world. Stanford White's masterpiece, but it doesn't have proper disabled access and a host of other problems which need to be addressed urgently with big money. But here is our library, and then we added a small wing to the library to adjust the scale of it down to the scale of the classroom buildings of the Stanford White campus. Next slide. Inside, we made a great big reading room modeled on Le Bruce Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève in part, Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, great monuments of the Beaux-Arts and great monuments on the evolution of the library type. And here you can see where the balconies provide casual and desk type places for people to work, and where they can work on computers and at tables. And there are also rooms all around it. And we worked with an artist to create panels. You can see some of them there, Daniel Cuban. And these are panels of illustrations of places in the Bronx. So we anchored the building in a great library tradition. In McKim, Mead, and White's libraries, which Boston Public Library of theirs was based on La Brousse. And we carried the story forward. It's a story worth telling and retelling in new and fresh ways. I see architecture as a storytelling art, not as an art of confrontation. I am not interested in the cancel culture. Next slide, please.
We actually asked you to do this, Bob,
right.
And you are very
and you
willing.
Cleaned up my prose. But when the Bloomberg administration advanced this thing that Manhattan was falling behind, and it wasn't looking enough like Shanghai, to which I added at some meeting organized by people from Shanghai, think they want to look like Manhattan. So I didn't quite understand the thinking, but a new zoning was proposed, and I argued, and with much conversations with Peg and others, that preservation had to be part of this formula of rebuilding. And at the time that the new zoning was being proposed, there was almost nothing preserved in the Midtown area. Yet there are buildings by James Gamble Rogers, Carrere and Hastings, Warren and Wetmore, you name it, that were being ignored. So preservation was finally, this was an article in the Times, was incorporated into the language and the movement. Not enough, I would say, going forward, please, because the preservation, next slide, please. The preservation of new buildings, quote unquote, like Skidmore's Union Carbide building, the son or daughter, as it were, of the Seagram building, was not landmarked, although many people thought it deserved it, and it's now being torn down by J.P. Morgan Chase to be replaced by the building you see by Norman Foster and his partners on the right. And you can see in the drawing at the top how much can be changed in Midtown. And the question is whether these new buildings will add to not only to the utility of Midtown and to its social desirability and commercial desirability, but also to its aesthetic desirability. Next, please. So we're losing buildings from the 60s. Even the new One Vanderbilt took down the first building to have been built, office building of consequence, in the Grand Central District right after the First World War. Nobody even took note of the loss of that building. And not much has been said about its role in swamping the iconic role of the Chrysler building on the skyline. Now, recently, a new scheme, which will bookend One Vanderbilt, for a new building which will bookend One Vanderbilt, has been released. Next slide, please. I had said, by the way, let's go back one. I'd made a point in that article in the Times that the zoning paid no attention to view corridors, and I warned that we could not guarantee that in the future the Chrysler building would be lost in a thicket of taller buildings. I hate to say that this is happening. Next, the beloved Chrysler building, which, by the way, architects and critics hated until the public started to wear T-shirts emblazoned with its image. It's showing that the public has a taste for architecture, but it's not necessarily the taste of the editors, the high editors of the high gurus of the Museum of Modern Art and other places like that. I love the Museum of Modern Art, but sometimes its pulse is not exactly the pulse of the people. So here is what is proposed. I'm hoping it really won't be built the way it is, with this gigantic gaping maw in the center, supposedly to reflect the central entrance of Warren and Wetmore's beautifully proportioned Grand Central Terminal building. And I never thought it would be possible to make one Vanderbilt look demure, but at least in this drawing, it looks like a stepchild to this gigantic inflated design by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, but not by David Childs, I think. And then drawn, it's interesting how this drawing is made. It's been released to the press, not showing the Chrysler Building at all. It's out of the picture. How little we know of what is valuable in our society. So on this pessimistic note, I'm going to end and turn this back. Thank you all, whoever stayed for this endless diatribe, and I will take questions if there are any.
We do have some, Bob.
Okay.
Let's see. Robert Moses has been admired and vilified. What's your opinion of him? And did he ever have an influence on you?
Did he ever what?
Have an influence on you?
Well, he was the man you loved to hate when I was in college and architecture school. He had many phases to his career, and certainly what he did in the 1920s and 30s was brilliant, and was still reaping the rewards of his vision. He became obsessed with cars, automobiles. He was a belligerent anti-public transportation person, which is too bad. His triple-decker at Brooklyn Heights, which is now being shored up as the city searches for money to rebuild it, is a brilliant piece of urban infrastructure. So he wasn't all bad, but the kinds of urban renewal that he sponsored in the post-World War II era, the slum clearance so-called, with the endlessly almost identical vocabulary of slab and cruciform towers, were destructive to the city, and the city has not yet recovered from it. And yet, yes, it gave people a better standard of housing then, but it didn't show a way to evolve that housing, which is why so many of the public housing projects are stuck at the moment in social dysfunction.
Of the projects we've seen, or the projects even we haven't seen, do you have a favorite of your own?
Fortunately, I have only one child, so he's my favorite. He's the prince. But as far as anything else, I have never had a favorite building. It's every client, every commission is an amazing investment in me and my partners and my colleagues. And we don't make everything perfect. And we know we can go back and make things better or better the next time, but we never have a favorite.
Actually, that's another question. If you could have a do-over on one of your projects, what would you change?
Well, I said at the beginning, I'd like to go back and rebuild some of those grand apartments that I savaged, but I have a feeling that subsequent owners have done that in many cases. But again, you try to make things better. Once in a while, we've been asked to add on to houses that I thought were not appropriate to be added on to, and I declined the commission. But then the owners who needed the extra space, I didn't deny that they needed it, hired other architects, and I was right to decline. Let somebody else ruin my work. I don't want to ruin it myself. But you hope for new opportunities all the time.
Who are the architects you admire today?
Well, I admire Frank Gehry for what he's accomplished. he's A and I'm B, or Alpha and Omega.
Mhm.
I think he's an amazing architect. There are so many others. I guess I will be in trouble if I identify any of them. But I admire the professionalism of Norman Foster immensely. And I think David Childs has produced some wonderful urban work, like the Columbus Circle development. We've just lost Caesar Pelli and Kevin Roach at very advanced ages, but I admired what each of them did in their own way. But they're not what I would do. So there you go. My favorite architect still remains me.
We seem to have lost Peg.
Uh-oh.
She jumped ship. I don't know.
I don't
Maybe her
know.
computer went down, but let me see if anyone has any other questions. How do you push back on those who argue that contemporary classicism presents a false view of history?
I don't think it is a false view of history. The contemporary classicism is an evolutionary stage in a 2,500 year sequence of forms and ideas. Just as the arguments about the nature of our Constitution reveal how much was dependent on the Greeks and Romans and how much was departed from them. I see the Peg is back, that's good. So to the classicists, but I do find it completely naive that the architects who advance so-called modernist agendas today don't realize how much work that they do is a revival of the Russian constructivists and other architects in the 19 teens and 20s. You cannot do good work without looking back to go forward. And an architect that just builds in the present is really not doing very much. So
Are you back with us,
we
Peg?
do
You're
classical
muted.
work. We don't do classical work. We do what Eero Saarinen, an architect of a previous generation, said he did: the style for the job. What is appropriate for each project? We look at each project anew, as though we were the assignment. We took it on fresh.
Mhm. So I can't see the screen now, unfortunately. So do we have any other questions, Rick?
I don't see any more. I think that was the last question.
Okay. Well, Bob, pardon the interruption, but thank you for a fascinating look through the city. And we love your architecture. We look forward to the next book. And thank you so much for spending the time with us.
Well, thank you for asking me and giving me the opportunity to share a long time love affair with this city and its architecture with members of your organization.
Wait a minute.
Preservation forever.
Maybe we have one more question. Marla,
Sure.
She says she's enchanted by this subway suburb and Roosevelt Island plan. It's great to better understand your thoughts on preserving heritage. Well, I guess it's just a compliment.
Well,
So a lot of compliments in the feed right now.
I'm open to compliments, and we better stop the questions before someone decides not to compliment me.
All right, Bob, thank you again. And thank you everybody for joining. And thank you, Rick. And
My pleasure.
yes, good night.
Thank you for this opportunity, and all of you have a good evening, please.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you.